Okay, I think it's time to kick off. Thank you and welcome everyone to Ecochain Technologies, simplifying product design for sustainability. My name is Kurt van der Linden. I am a sustainable business specialist here in-house at Ecochain. We'll start with the agenda and move on to the speakers, starting with our CEO, Frans Willem de Kloot. Moving to the agenda now. There are four things you can expect today. Firstly, the time is now presented by Frans Willem. Then we'll have a live modeling session in Mobius. That will be of a table done by Alissa. She will then recap the design process, and I will answer some questions and answers at the end. These are the familiar faces you can look for today. Starting on the left, Frans Willem, the CEO of Ecochain. Then we're moving to Alissa, eco design specialist here in-house in Amsterdam. And myself, of course, sustainable business specialist, Kurt van der Linden. Handing it over to the polls now, what I would like to do is start off with this one here. Let me see. Polls. And what I like to do is start with this one just here. So this is just essentially trying to find out what everyone's LCA knowledge is before. Great. Thank you. Just waiting for a few more answers and then I'll move on. Looks like the vast majority are beginner here, which is good to know. Hopefully 7 more people will answer. If not, I will move on. Okay. 2 more people. Great. I will stop that poll there. I actually have another one to ask later on. So I'm going to share the results of this now. About 50% of the people here are actually beginners. Good to see. That's exactly why we have made this webinar today. So I'm going to stop sharing that one there. And I will then move on to the next part. Frans Willem, the time is now. Take it away, please.
Thanks, Koert, and hello everybody. Welcome to the call today. And good to see that there is a mix of people in terms of beginner to advanced, because that's actually my role to put a bit of context around what Alissa is going to explain to you later. There's a risk for some of you then again, as I saw that you know that already, but be assured I will make it short so that you don't waste too much time on things you already know. But the time is now, right? And go to the next slide. And this slide, you know, we could have used, or we could have used many other slides, but I'm pretty sure that I have to not tell anybody in this call that you know, there is an urgency in what we're looking at. We as humankind have too much impact on our planet and on ourselves at the end and on nature. And we need to do something about it. But the fact is also, and I'm also sure that you are aware that products, and especially physical products, play a very, very key role in the impact we have together. And that is the topic for today. 50%, for instance, of all the emissions worldwide is caused by physical products. But again, it is a very obvious one, and therefore also product companies need to change. Good, if you can go to the next slide. And this is one I look at. I like to look at a lot in terms of maturity, but there are also, again, also there are different pictures, but also there, you know, there are different levels of maturity if you look specifically at product or companies or manufacturing companies. And it all starts with compliance at the left bottom. Yeah? So first thing you do, of course, as a company, you look at regulations, you know, do I already adhere to all the rules which are set and so forth. But very quickly you will start looking at also what is actually the impact I have as a company, and can I set myself any commitment or targets to it? You know, SBTI targets, net zero targets. You know, you hear a lot about that, and it is actually what a lot of companies at the moment are doing. But if you are a product company, a manufacturer, or your product brand, or you're a retailer, you're dealing with products and physical products, very quickly you will understand that 95% of your impact actually comes from your products. Very logical, right? And then there are two areas where you can look at. First of all, it's really around operational excellence. It's about, can I reduce my transport? Can I reduce maybe, or can I change my energy mix? Where, so there are things, or maybe waste losses or whatever. So that is something you can look at, but you will also understand that you can never get to serious targets. You can never get to net zero if you don't look at the products itself and the innovation of the products. And Alissa will give you a bit of a view on how that would work if you work with software and how that can help you. But ultimately, you need to look at efficiency improvements, but also at innovation of your products. Use different materials, maybe design other products, ultimately to get to a generation safe future. Next slide, Kurt. So products, and product impact insights play an important role. I already explained that products have a huge impact on the total impact of a product or manufacturing company. But for instance, we work with a company called Unilever, you're also familiar with. If you look at the supply chain impact of Unilever, they calculated that on 76%. I find it always an interesting number. So the total impact of Unilever, 76% of Unilever's impact is determined by their supply chain and the suppliers of their supply chain. So if you want to change ultimately the impact of Unilever, you have to work with your suppliers, and that has, of course, a huge impact on how we work as companies. And this, again, is valid for small and big companies. And also what is very clear is that, one sec. And what is also very clear is that the impact of products is for a very large part determined in the design phase. This is not a number coming from us, but this is actually coming from the EU, right? So because they have researched this, and in the design phase, we determine a lot of the impact in terms of how it's used, how often it's used, can you repair it still, and you're probably also aware that there is eco-design regulation even coming from the EU to exactly cover this topic. But there's more regulation coming. There are green claims, or greenwashing is an important one, which is already in place. So there's also more risk with product companies about the impact. How do you report the impact of your products, and is it rightfully so? EU research also proved that over 50% of all the claims done by products are actually false claims, and that is now being addressed in this green claim legislation. But there's more, CSRD, the company reporting also has impact on products, of course, because, as I said already, if you're a product company, the majority of your impact will come from your products. Next slide. Yes, and then a very quick introduction to LCA and why this is so important, because if you want to have insights on your product impact, you need to have a methodology, right, which is worldwide accepted, and which is a sort of a common language you can share with either your customers or with your vendors. And a life cycle assessment in that sense is a worldwide accepted methodology. And why is it? Because it's basically covering the full value chain of a product, really from raw materials, processing the product, transportation, how it's used in the life, in the phase, and also the end of life. So how is it recycled, or is it being wasted? And if we talk about LCAs are also the foundation for product carbon footprints, PCFs. Maybe you've heard of that as well. So it is really a foundation for a lot of the work done in understanding the impact of products. I'll leave it to this because in the sense of what is an LCA, but if you are interested in understanding more about an LCA and you are a beginner, I recommend you to go to our website. There is an LCA beginner course as well, and a really nice one, and you get more details on this. But if you go to the next slide, of course. There are also complexities to LCA. We also have to be fair about that, so it's not a perfect world in that sense. because again, LCAs are complex. And as you can imagine, for instance, data and gathering data, which you need to calculate the impact of a product, is already quite difficult. You have to go into your value chain. You have to go into your supply chain, maybe to the suppliers of your suppliers. So that is a challenge. And because the data is hard to get, you have to sometimes make assumptions. You have to cut corners to basically at the end get already some idea of the impact of your products. That is a challenge. Because sometimes you deal with very complex processes, you have to simplify the processes to calculate something. And because of all of this, sometimes the interpretation of a impact can be different depending on who you ask. I always like the example of leather, right? Is leather, is that a product or a byproduct? And you can imagine that determining what it is also has a huge impact on what the impact is on the total product of a shoe, for instance. The good news is that there is a lot happening in the world in equalizing these kind of complexities. So there are more and more industries are looking at product category rules, which basically means that within industries and niche industries, companies are agreeing on how do we calculate an LCA? And so to make sure that we get an apple-to-apple comparison. There's a lot of initiatives also on EU level, so that it doesn't only look at let's say a German rules, but also makes it wider into the EU. And there are also all sorts of industry initiatives to make sure that we all talk the same language in this space. Here you see the PACT, which is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development initiative, which has a pathfinder framework to basically let suppliers talk to large FMCG companies and some more. But there are also other initiatives. Catena X is one in the automotive industry. You have FEFCO in the cardboard packaging. Sorry, I was looking for the word cardboard packaging industry, but there are many more. But it's all about making sure that we talk the same language if we talk about these topics. Next slide. Good. And there are business challenges. So one is I would say the technical challenges of an LCA. These are more business challenges. So LCAs are there already for a long time, since the 60s, but they have traditionally been always created by consultants. And that was logical because maybe companies needed one LCA per year or even less. And to spend, because a consultant is expensive, maybe 50,000 euros or 100,000 euros on creating one LCA is okay in that sense. And that's also a reason why LCAs up until today are still not really widely used. It's really increasing. We see the demand also increasing, but it's still not widely used. Because of the demand is increasing and because regulations are requiring more and more LCAs, the consultant approach doesn't work anymore because basically it's too expensive. And the other thing is that a lot of the LCA tools are often made for LCA specialists. Nothing wrong with that, but basically you're then importing the consultancy job into your company and you still have a problem that you basically need LCA specialists, which are hard to get. And you still need to do a lot of work to basically get the right LCAs out of it. And we believe that the companies more and more are looking at LCAs and PCFs on portfolio level, and that you want to take the LCA knowledge in-house. And for that, you need software which is easier to understand. And potentially, you can also work with non-experts on these tools. And Alissa will explain later on also how easily that can be done if you are not a full expert yet. Next slide, Kurt. And other reasons why you would need software. One is, and Alissa will again also show that in her overview, in many cases you will need secondary data. That means data which is not coming from your supplier because the supplier doesn't have the data, for instance. But you have to get a good replacement of that data or the impact of that data through a worldwide acknowledged database. And so it's important that that database is also in the software so that you can use it in your modeling. Again, Alissa will show you how that works in a few minutes. You need software basically to already very quickly actually get an understanding of what is the impact of my product and how can I change it. Again, Alissa will show you how that works. Ultimately, you want to have a full view of your portfolio, and also compare parts of your portfolio or products with each other. So also there, software is very helpful. And ultimately, software, and again, Alissa will show you how that works, will also give you an idea on how to work on continuous improvements. Because if you look at the hotspots of an impact of a product, once you have solved one hotspot, you get other hotspots, and therefore you continuously start to work on the improvements of the product. Again, Alissa will show you greatly how that would work. Next slide, Kurt. And that's, and Alissa will do that in our tool called Ecochain Mobius, and which was specifically designed for this to really, I would say, for business users, get an easy understanding of the impact of products. Alissa will show you how that works. Kurt, next slide. Yeah, so to recap my story, the time is now. There's a lot of pressure on all product companies. It doesn't matter if you're big or small, even if you're an impact brand, it doesn't matter. There's a lot of need to understand the impact of products and to understand it as quickly as possible, and to start working with this at least and get an understanding. LCA is the methodology, and with LCA I also mean PCF. If you hear about that, it's a worldwide used standard. So basically, if you create an LCA in France, you can also share the LCA in the US or in Asia, and it goes beyond carbon. I would like to emphasize that LCA also really has different product categories like water, toxification, or similar things. And again, it doesn't have to be complicated and expensive. You can really start now when you have the right tools. And with that, I also would like to end. Just start. We like to use a phrase a lot with our customers: "Don't let perfect stand in the way of good," which really is applicable for LCAs because it is complex. I don't think we need to shy away from the fact that it is complex, but you can start simple, and that would already give you insights which you can work with. So you can, in an iterative process, you can really create more and more insights about your products and your product portfolio. So let the complexity not stand in your way to start today. With that said, I put the context there, and I'm really looking forward, hopefully with you as well, to listen to Alissa and how really this works in practice, in reality.
Thank you so much for that, Frans Willem. I'm sure we'll be in contact at the end where there are some questions coming in as well, I see. So I will pick that up with you later on. I'd like to move towards the fun part of this webinar today, and I'll present this now to Alissa, moving towards talking about live modeling of the table, and then she will jump into the Mobius tool.
So I think it's good to start with a story, right? Let's put ourselves in the shoes of people watching this webinar and what they would use Mobius to accomplish. In this case, my CEO listened to Frans Willem and decided it was a brilliant idea for him to ask me, the product designer, to come up with a plan to reduce our best-selling pine wood table's sustainable impact. Let's say the focus was on carbon, right? In order to even start that out, first, we need to understand the impact of our pine wood table first, and then from there on, we'll understand better how to reduce it. Next slide, please, Kurt. Right. So I organized here some very simple steps of starting your sustainable product design. So what I would like to do first, of course, is modeling the original product. So we have a benchmark for our eco-design actions. Starting is already quite a big obstacle for people who are just starting off with LCAs, and it's understandable why. You have to go through a learning curve. Therefore, I always recommend starting with a product flowchart. This is nothing new. We're kind of like geographers of the scientific world where we like to draw things out. So yeah, Your flowchart is simply supposed to reflect the story of how your product is made. And from creating this flowchart, I hope you'll see from there how much better you'll understand the sort of data you will need to also map out the environmental impact of your table, of our table in this case. Next slide, please. Perfect. So here I have a little table. What I want to emphasize really is this alignment between the story and the data, right? So what do you need to build it? That will give you a good indication of the material amounts you will need. Where do these materials travel from? Because LCAs actually calculate upstream impacts related to your product. Therefore, it is the most credible way of measuring a product's environmental impact. You have to also source out the distances per material traveling from your supplier to your factory gate. And of course, the story of how those raw materials get transformed into your final product gives us a good indication of the energy going into it, as well as the waste coming out of it. And the waste is also quite important in your production process because you need to also account for the emissions related to disposing that waste, right? Next slide, please, Kurt. Right, perfect. So in visual form, this is what our Pinewood tables flowchart would look like. As a product designer, I already have a good idea about what's probably going on in the back end, right? So I gathered that there's this truck and then needs to transport our raw materials. These dashed lines here represent the gates of our factory. So these raw materials arrive to our factory gates, and these are the internal processes going on to transform these raw materials into our best-selling Pinewood table, of course. Of course, I also denoted wastes occurring, which occurs at the cutting pine wood, as well as the electricity going in. And if it's manual, you'll also see how we handle that as well. What we're doing right now is eco-designing based on the system boundary of cradle to gate. So just so you guys understand, that simply means from your raw material extraction all the way down to your finished product packaged and ready to be shipped to your client. So it does not include any shipping yet. It's just at the end of your factory gates, ready to be shipped, right? Perfect. Right. So as you can also see from this flowchart, what I want to emphasize as well is that if I, as a product person, don't really know certain in this flowchart, I can actually use this flowchart as an internal aid and ask people around me internally, hey, do you perhaps know where I could find this data? This is the sort of data I'm looking for. And it really helps with dialogue rather than simply asking in word form. And I think that's simply because humans are much more attuned to visual forms. Let's put it that way. Next slide, please, Kurt. Nice. So yeah, through this flowchart, I understood better the sort of data I would need. And internally, I ran around asking the right personnel. Also, just a little tip, most of the time your finance department knows a lot of the data that you will need because they are the ones buying it. And they tend to know how far it travels as well, yada, yada. So if you are really at a loss at who to ask, always go straight to the finance department first. And of course, I've acquired those numbers that you see in this flowchart. And now I'm ready to model our Pinewood table on Mobius. And I'm going to hop onto Mobius now. And since our focus is really on eco-designing, I have already pre-created the original product of a table we want to eco-design on, but there are some missing elements of the product that I will add as well, just to give you a good indication of how to work with Mobius. All right, so let me share my screen. Great. All right, I hope everyone sees my screen. Do I have okay, I see a thumbs up, which is always a good indication. All righty. So here you see already our product inventory builder. It's basically where we're going to put all our data in. And as you saw, following from our flowchart, there's already data inputted in there, right? But you can tell that our main ingredient is already kind of missing. So let's put that in, eh? Right. So I kind of made these header objects just to keep things nicely organized for the sake of the webinar. But of course, as long as you count for everything, you don't actually need that. But that's the flexibility of Mobius as well. So I'm just going to add a sub item into here. Perfect. And I found out we sourced our pine wood from Sweden. Perfect. So you can already see that I can't edit the unit in here. And that's simply because I already pre-created this object. And if I pre-create it, I get to tell Mobius what unit it is. And that's because Mobius works with this idea of reusing their blocks. So each name is a unique ID for a block. And that really helps a lot in terms of efficiency, especially if you are reusing the same materials, perhaps also from the same suppliers, right? And in this case, just so you understand, there's a reason why I also denote the geographical location. And that's simply because I don't have primary data from my suppliers regarding the impact of the pine wood I'm getting from them. So in that case, I just used our nifty little EcoQuery database in the back end, and I used it to find an average for the the emissions related to the production of pine wood from Sweden. And you'll see better how that happens as well a little bit later on. But yeah, since everything is a unique object, and maybe I might be using another object related to pine wood from a different place, hint, hint, then I would need to create a new object for that as well, and I would name it differently. So of course, remembering from our flowchart, we needed 0.018 cubic meter. So let's add that in there. Perfect. Great. Oh, wow. Well, there we go. Nice. So of course, you can also see that processing energy is missing from this. Of course, we needed energy. You saw that our production process was actually a bit more granular. It showed you each little production process, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to bundle up all that electricity together and put down just one object with the sum amount of electricity going into this pine wood table. So let's also add our sub item in there. Factory electricity, Netherlands, right? Same thing here. It's already pre-created. So Mobius remembers that. And it's already linked to a data set. So let's just put down the amount. And I believe it was 1.9 kilowatt hours. Perfect. All right. So now our pine wood table is complete. So I hope you kind of saw how that got translated from our flow chart into basically these 4 categories of data that we needed. And I just added in our transportation there, our waste disposal in here. It got incinerated internally, the processing energy here, as well as our initial raw ingredients, right? So now that we see our final impact, we need to figure out how to eco-design with this, right? So my CEO wanted an action plan from me. And now that I have our, in Dutch, we call it nulmetings, our benchmark, we can easily see the hotspots of what is actually contributing the most to our impact. And it's very important to understand that, because if you just look at this without the numbers, it's very difficult to make effective changes. And by understanding your greatest hotspots, that's probably where you should focus your efforts into achieving the greatest reductions related to your product, eh? So I'm gonna go to my table here. And here you already see your hotspots. I mean, you can see it in different forms. We have a bar chart here too, donut chart, but it's quite evident that it's related to the truck transport. And if I go back to my model, I wanna see what exactly is going on in the transportation. And you can already see that the mammoth of impact is actually related to the amount of pine wood and the distance related to the pine wood being transported, right? So this number might look quite unfamiliar to you if you're just starting off with LCAs, but just as a little back note, in LCAs, we measured the impact related to distance, not in terms of kilometers, but in terms of ton kilometers. And the reason why we do that is simply because let's say you have a truck and your product only takes up a certain portion of the truck's loading capacity, right? It's traveling from A to B, and the environmental emissions is usually just related to the total of this truck emitting when it's traveling from A to B, right? So some guys said, whoa, that's terribly unfair because my product in a truck only takes up a portion of the truck, and there are other products in there that should share that environmental impact. And therefore, to make things more fair, we came up with the idea of the ton kilometer. So I have a little Excel here to kind of show you how I got these numbers, right? So you see here that with the screws, simply because it started from kg, I just multiplied it by the kilometers it traveled, and that gave me the ton kilometers. For the wood, it was in cubic meters. So of course, to convert that into your tons, you need to understand the density. And in this case, I found out the density was 500. If I didn't get this information from our supplier, I could also just ask Google, what's the average density of pine wood? And in that case, I converted it to my tons here, multiplied it by this very large distance it's traveling from Sweden, and got 13.5 as you saw here. So in effect, I see one big action point I can already implement, and that is sourcing pine wood from a closer supplier. So let's try that out. If you click on tools here, we do have a tool specifically for this. It's simply called the scenarios tool. So let's click on that. Right. Let's create a new scenario. Boom. So essentially what Mobius did was create a copy of the previous, of the original pine table, and it added copy to the end. And that's again, because of the unique building blocks that we use in Mobius. You can't reuse you can't create two objects with the same name. And that's why it automatically says copy to it. Everything else underneath is the same because it's still the same object, right? So I always suggest to immediately rename it to reflect the changes you're gonna make. And in this case, because I want to reduce transport, maybe I would just find pine wood from Germany instead of Sweden, right? As you saw from our flow chart, our production facility was based in the Netherlands. So it makes sense that maybe Germany is the closest supplier. You can delve into the database to see what else is in there. But for now, let's assume that, hey, let's try some German pine wood. So I'm going to put down German pine wood here, just so it's clear. All right, cool. So now here, let's add a new object underneath our bill of materials to replace the amount of pine wood there. So because we're creating a new material, nothing's going to pop up. And here I'm setting the unit to our cubic meters, and the amount was 0.018. Add item. All right. So still there's no impact attributed to it yet. And it's quite difficult to get firsthand data from your supplier. In the future, hopefully, fingers crossed, it's going to get easier because of legislation. But in the meantime, we can just rely on averages. And indeed, as Franz Willem mentioned, please don't let perfect get in the way of good. That's the whole point of this webinar too, is the idea of simplification, right? So in this case, let's put down pine wood, see what's coming up. All right, so we have 306 data sets. This is a bit intimidating, eh? So what I always suggest is filtering out the right version of the database you want to use. And in this case, if you're not following a certain standard that may want you to use a particular version of a database, I always recommend using the latest version. And I'm gonna go with EcoInvent, and that's simply because EcoInvent is the gold standard when it comes to averages in Europe. So let's just click on that. Cool. Effectively, we've reduced it to 78 data sets, and we were looking for Germany. So let's just filter that out. Oh, whoa. Maybe if I just did pine. There we go. Perfect. Right. Now we have 16 data sets. Well, You might be a little bit confused looking at this, but there is a way to read this. And that's simply because of the way data sets are named by ecoquery. And in this case, you see that the first bit actually just all reflects the production process. And then when you have this bar here, it simply indicates that there's a product coming out of that production process, right? And then now you might start to see that, oh, there are different products perhaps coming out from the same production process. So always watch out for this. We're not interested in wood chips. That's not what we're using to make our pine wood table. We are interested in the saw log and veneer log though. So that's the right data set we're going to pick. Same for the pulpwood, that's not what we need. Also for your cleft timber as well. And this is simply oak wood, which is not at all the softwood that we're using for this table. So in that case, I am going to add this data set to pin to our object here. Perfect. So just so you know, the climate change impact here is just related to one of its predefined unit. And Mobius already understands you're using this amount. And so it has scaled the amount, the climate change impact to using that amount of pine wood. All right. So since you see the Swedish pine wood underneath, you're seeing that, oh, whoa, it's actually impacting more, but our focus is on the transportation, right? So let's just delete the Swedish pine wood from here first and see what effect sourcing from a closer supplier is going to have on our pine wood table. All right, so let's go down here and we have that 13.5 ton kilometers. And if I just move to our Excel here and I switch to our new German supplier, Das Holz, we'll understand that now from 1,500 kilometers, it's 400, and the total 10 kilometers is traveling is 3.6. So let's change that in here. 3.6. There we go. Right, nice. Okay, so it's a new object now. Mobius recognizes that, so please always rename, otherwise you might forget later on. So I'm just going to denote our German pine wood here and our transportation header, also to reflect that this is the one related to our German pine wood. Oop. Nice. So let's see what actually happens. Wow. Okay. So effectively, by reducing that distance, even if our pine wood's productions actually increased a bit, we've effectively overall reduced our pine wood table's impact by 34%, right? And that's already a dramatic reduction just by focusing on your hotspots. And just to move on as well, the idea too behind creating LCAs and eco-designing is the reiterative process. So now, of course, if we're actually just looking at this pine wood table with the new German pine wood, we'll have a better idea what the new hotspot is and how we can reduce that as well. So let's go to our products. I'm going to open this up now, just so I can see the hotspots and back to the table. And effectively, now our hotspot goes down to the factory electricity that we're using. And in which case, if I go back to our model and let's check out the data set related to this. All right. So it's actually a data set related to the grid electricity in the Netherlands, right? So a good question to ask now is, what if I purchased 100% wind energy instead? Like, what change will that actually make now to this table? So let's go back into our our scenarios mode, create a new scenario. And I'm going to rename this as well. And I'm going to call it 100% wind. This time I'm going to copy and paste. So I skip all that typing. right. Oh, I believe I forgot to rename this. There we go. Cool. All right. So if I look here, we have 1.9 kilowatt hours. So I'm just going to add beneath that our wind energy, of course, in the Netherlands. Our unit is in kilowatt hours, and the amount is 1.9. So let's just replace 100% of that with wind. Now I'm going to remove this. Yes. And rename that as well. Boom. And now let's find the appropriate data set. Perfect. Again, if I do wind electricity, okay, I'm getting multiple hits. Let's select our latest database, as we mentioned before. And now let's also filter by location, Netherlands. Cool. There are 4 data sets, in which case here, if you already have a potential supplier for your wind energy, then I would ask them, look, what is the most common what is the most common technology you're using to source that electricity? What sort of turbines, onshore or offshore, how many megawatts? But because we don't have that sort of information, you can simply go for the national average. And because I am an eco-design specialist, I already know that in the Netherlands, the most common wind electricity, the source we have is actually onshore with 1 to 3 megawatt turbines. So that is what I'm going to pick in this case. So I believe that's exactly what we need. And I'm going to add that in there. Perfect. Just to double check. Always make sure also your properties is aligned. Perfect. And let's see what impact that actually has. Okay. So now we've effectively reduced our impact further by 45%, which is quite a lot. And actually, if we just compare that final version to our original table, so tools, let's compare products, and then let's pick out that latest version we have. Oops. Oh, oops. Seems like I accidentally compared it with myself. So let's go back to this. Tools, compare products. Perfect. We've reduced it by 64% in total, which is actually quite a lot, right? So, of course, with these scenarios I have come up with, I've effectively created a potential plan of action to present to my CEO, right? So now you can go back internally and maybe they're going to ask you, what's the cost? Well, that's the point of being able to project the impact of your eco-design actions. Now, once you take that back to your internal drawing board and you show them on Mobius the impacts of changing certain things, they'll be able to find out whether that German pine wood costs too much to implement, and that maybe they'll source from another supplier that is just a bit further from Germany, but still closer than Sweden, for example, and see how much total reductions that's going to have on your pine wood table, right? So that is how myself as a product designer could use Mobius using sort of assumptions that I've made to create a action plan with something that I can actually present to my CEO to take back to discuss and see what is actually a good course of action for us. And that concludes our live modeling on Mobius. Of course, if we go back to the slides now, we can do a little recap. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to.
Thanks for that, Alissa. I will just go back to sharing my screen here. So if you just give a quick recap, and then what I'm doing, I'm just looking at my second screen here, getting a couple of questions in. So we'll go into that as well. So yeah, jump into the recap and then we'll move to the questions.
Right. So of course, a little recap and synchronization of what was just made, what we just went through just now. First, my CEO came up, he asked, hey, how can we make our Pinewood table much more reduce its carbon impact? And so what I did first was model our original product. So we have a benchmark to compare how our eco design actions is going to lead to reductions in our climate change impact, right? In this case, there were a lot of missing data from our primary supplier. Actually, all of it was missing data. So I just used EcoInvent to fill in those gaps. Let's put it that way. Then through that, I got an instant insight into what was contributing the most to my product's environment, my climate change impact. And in that case, it was the transportation. So we thought, what if we switch from a Swedish supplier to a German one for our pine wood, which would effectively reduce our impact by what, around 35%? Then afterwards, we also saw that through that, creating that scenario and testing out that hypothesis, another hotspot, which led to changing our electricity from the grid electricity in the Netherlands to wind electricity in the Netherlands, which contributed to another 45% reduction. And in effect, ultimately, we reduced our impact if we applied these two changes by around 65%, right? So the idea behind that is you're able to project what your actions are going to impact your end product. Maybe these numbers are not exact, but even if you got primary data from your supplier later on, more likely than not, it will still show very similar things. And that's simply because EcoInvent averages are averages, and you can have more precise data, but the bulk of emissions will probably remain in the same group, right? And in that case, I took it back to the drawing board and discussed internally how much that would cost and whether it's a viable decision. And if not, then we can also further eco-design with different ideas in mind. Yeah.
Okay. Just going to the questions now. I've seen about, let me see, 4, 5, 6 questions here. I got a couple for Alissa and Franz Willem as well. So this one here is actually directed at you, Alissa. What criteria are used to assess sustainability of a product during design?
Yeah. So there is a reason why I very much emphasize on the idea that my CEO came up to me and asked to reduce the climate change impact of our pine wood table. Because as Franz Willem mentioned earlier as well, LCAs are able to show you the emissions and impact of different categories altogether. Can show you water use as well. And right now, the hot topic is our carbon emissions. Therefore, that's related to our climate change impact. And although this is the case, what you need to formulate internally with your company is your internal vision and goals, mostly in relation also to your industry concerns when it comes to the environment, right? Because let's say if I'm a furniture company, I'm sure we're not going to just be worried about climate change. We're going to be worried about deforestation as well, which is linked to another impact category we have, which is resource depletion. So of course, once you have a better understanding of which impact categories your industry are more or less concerned from, maybe you don't just want to eco-design from one impact category's perspective. Sustainability and eco-designing is a game of trade-offs. So if you create a reduction by implementing an action that reduces your climate change impact, maybe that actually increases your water use impact, for example. And what is more or less important to you guys as a company will be related exactly to that internal strategy and goal that you guys formulated from the beginning of what is important to you. Yeah. Otherwise, you may get lost.
Yeah, thanks for that one, Alissa. Just going directly into the next one, actually. So what happens to the table at the end of its life cycle?
So just to go back on what we modeled just now, we only modeled the cradle to gate. So our product was ready to be shipped to our clients, right? But of course, what happens to the end of life of your products could also be included in your LCA. And what happens is actually very much dependent on where your product is going to be disposed of, which is also linked to why data sets, even for the same processes, are they give you different regional or different country-specific data for that. Because if I dispose of this pine wood table in the Netherlands versus in Thailand, for example, it may have a very different impact. In Thailand, maybe they just incinerate everything. And here in the Netherlands, they recycle everything, which, as you can imagine, would lead to very different impacts as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have this next question from Franz Willem, actually. It's regarding Mobius and industries you can use. So specifically, is Mobius applicable for any industry? Franz Willem?
Well, one of the good things of an LCA is that it's
Oh, Franz Willem, you're still muted, I believe.
Am I? Shouldn't be.
No. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So one of the good things of an LCA, as I already explained, is that it's industry agnostic. Basically, the methodology works for any physical product or even non-physical product. But let's focus on physical products. Fact is that, of course, some industries are more easier than others. Also, if you've seen by Alissa, a pine wood table, of course, is easier to model than maybe a very complex television system or a set-top box. But in essence, every product, either produced or assembled, can be modeled in Mobius, and an LCA can therefore be created.
Okay, thank you. And then, so I have another question or two for you as well. And just to remind everyone, please send the questions in. I will follow them up regardless, even via email. And we can talk about that in a meeting as well. So going back to the question now, Alissa, how do you actually find the right data if you don't have the raw material list?
Oh, okay. Now there are two ways about it. Okay. So let's say that you actually have this tangible product in front of you that you want to measure. Well, you can literally just disassemble it and group them by the same materials and weigh them. Mass balance also applies in LCA. So more likely than not, that's probably the weight of the materials we'll need. Of course, it's not very accurate or precise because you don't know, for example, how much waste was created during that process. And maybe for example, your wood is coated with something, right? So you don't exactly know how much is being coated on this wood, but that's the beauty of also creating a logic to justify your assumptions, in which case you can say, on average, if I want to coat a table, I know the surface area of the wood, and I'm imagining a average coat thickness, and that's can be translated into a volume of formula you would use to coat that table, right? So that's one way to do it. And if you're really in the dark about it, then honestly, you could just ask Google. I mean, you could ask and look online, like what is the generic process behind making a pine wood table or a table in general, and make assumptions. As long as you list out your story and the assumptions and your justifications for it, you will have something to measure. But I really hope you're not left in the dark with everything. As I mentioned, if you really feel like you're in the dark, ask your finance department. They know how much they're buying from where in order to do or create something. That's just part of the checks and balances, right, of your company. So that's how I would go about it.
Perfect. Just looking at the time here, we have enough time for one more question per panelist. Looking at my second screen again, I saw this one come up a few times. So how do you actually know, and this one is for Franz Willem, how do you actually know that the calculation is correct? So is there some sort of support or consultation around Mobius?
Yeah, no, very quick answer. Yeah, of course. We have wonderful people like Alissa in the company who can, of course, help our customers when there are difficult questions. So definitely there is help around. And in the tool, we also have a lot of ways to gather the information yourself or get tutorial videos. And we also have a talk to an expert facility, which basically means that at any time you can set up a short call with an expert and get some input, or even have the modeling you have done being checked by a separate specialist. So yeah, there are multiple ways to support customers in that way.
Yeah, perfect.
Because it is complex, so it is definitely useful. But we also have customers who basically do it all themselves without any of our support. So it depends. Also depends a bit on how much effort you want to put into it and how much time you want to put into it.
Thank you for that. And one final question, and then I will wrap everything up. So Alissa, addressed to you on my screen here, it says, is there a way to have an overview of different possible design choices of the table? Like what could have been a better material with a lower impact, for example?
Well, let's imagine that was our hotspot at some point was related to the material. Of course, alternative material is really linked to why you are using this original material in the first place. It's obviously because it has certain qualities to serve a certain function, right? So you want to find an alternative material that's able to serve that and see how that compares in terms of its environmental impact. And that's something you can do just simply by seeing 1 kg of material X compared to 1 kg of material Y. For the same material, even before you consider alternative materials, maybe you'd consider the production process. Different production processes of the same material could lead to lower or higher emissions, for example. So there are many ways to also go about that.
Hey, Koert, maybe just to quickly, because one very nice example, which is also on our website, if you want to look at it, is Willycroft. Willycroft is a vegan cheese and butter company. And they used actually cashew nuts in their production, and they figured out through Mobius that actually cashew nuts are quite pollutive in terms of impact. And because of that, they changed the materials to beans. Because they had the same outcome, but had a much lower impact. So yeah, that kind of choices. But again, it starts with insights, and then you can of course understand. You can look at what are the differences we can take in terms of innovation to take it further.
Thanks for that, Franz Willem. And that's a perfect finishing note there. So we do have our 14-day free trial, and as you did say that we do have those support services around Mobius. There's actually access to 2 calls of our Talk to an Expert, so you can know what to expect when you do actually implement Mobius for your company. If you want to talk to us, send me an email, check out this QR code. We can exchange some ideas on how to implement this for your specific product in your specific industry. On that note, thank you very much for joining. Keep in contact. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Koert. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.